everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of Learn About Early Music with Ensemble Hespery. I'm MJ.
And I'm Tom. And in fact, you're going to be hearing from all 4 members of Ensemble Hespery later on, because we're going to be talking to Magda and Florence about how they tune the cello and the violin.
So today we're talking about tuning, you might have guessed. And we usually want to be in tune with each other. Generally speaking, in Baroque music particularly, this is required. So how do we actually manage to do it?
Well, that's what we're going to be discussing. Now, the first thing we have to do when we approach a rehearsal or a concert or a performance of some sort is get the harpsichord tuned. And that's kind of the sort of cornerstone, really, to tuning, because it's responsible for setting the temperament that we're in. So just a little bit about temperaments, for those of you who might not know about them. The temperament is effectively a way of tuning some of the intervals unequally. So we're not actually tuning every single interval the same on the harpsichord.
No.
And that gives certain keys, certain chords, a particular characteristic. Now, just to demonstrate that, effectively what happens is that because of the way we're tuning, certain keys, and it's particularly relevant in the interval of a third, sound better or worse than others. So that actually gives each chord and each piece, indeed, a certain character.
Yeah, and this is because we're not tuning in equal temperament. Yeah.
So if we're in equal temperament, that means that every single interval is the same size.
Between each note.
Whereas when we're tuning on the harpsichord, although we can tune this in equal temperament, we don't tend to for the repertoire that we play in Ensemble Hespery.
That's right.
We tune in a way in which some of the intervals are bigger or smaller, as I was saying. Now, when we have a third that's smaller, it sounds better. It sounds slightly sweeter. And I'm just going to demonstrate an example of a fairly nice third, which would be something like this one. So that's actually slightly smaller. I'm now going to tune one. I'm going to actually give you F sharp and A sharp. So it's a very remote one, and this is by way of example. This third is incredibly big compared to the third that I just played, which was C and E. And you'll hear that it's actually not so pleasant to hear.
To be honest, that's absolutely horrible.
Compared to something like a C major.
So why is that horrible?
Well, it's simply because that third is wide. It's big.
Wide.
So a smaller third sounds nicer. A smaller third sounds better. And one of the words that we think about when we're tuning is the word pure. If you tune something pure, it means that the sound waves between 2 frequencies are completely matching. So the peaks and the troughs of those sound waves are absolutely in sync, and there's no beating. Whereas when something is out of sync, you can imagine sort of a phase effect, we hear this kind of a beating, because they're not in tune. But
we can't tune everything pure, can we?
We can't
that would
tune
be nice.
Because that, theoretically, you might be thinking that would be great.
Would be great.
Sadly, just because of the sort of laws of nature and physics, it isn't possible to tune everything pure. Because we end up with this kind of slight difference, which was basically theorised by Pythagoras.
Not to go into too much detail, but yes.
Effectively, what we're doing is we're spreading out that difference in different ways. And of course, there are many different ways that you can do it in order to achieve effect. We basically tune in the interval of a fifth. That's what we're using to tune. But the way we tune the fifths, by making them slightly bigger or slightly smaller than pure, or some of them we have as pure in different temperaments. And I think you're going to be seeing a picture of a tuning wheel in a moment, which has those different sizes. It tells you those different sizes. The way we do that affects how the thirds come out. And as I was demonstrating there, the sort of evidence of what we really hear is not so much that whether the fifths are wide or small or pure, it's actually the quality of the thirds that results from the way we do those fifths. So that's just a little introduction to temperaments. Of course, it's a huge topic.
Huge.
So hopefully that's a little introduction just to kind of what we're doing there. And the reason that we do it is basically so that we can have a priority. Some chords and some keys are nicer than others, and that works beautifully with the music that we play.
Absolutely, and that gives a real character and a real interest to the music we play.
Okay, so when we tune the harpsichord, the first thing we need to do is actually get a reference pitch, so that we can actually tune the instrument to a pitch. And that's generally taken from a tuning fork. Or these days you can get very good phone apps which will actually give you a really accurate pitch. And we use A generally to get that pitch. So having tuned that note, generally this tenor A here, we then proceed to tune the temperament and set the temperament in this opening octave. And of course we're using these tuning pins here. Each string is wrapped around one of those, so by turning it we can effectively make the string very slightly longer or very slightly shorter to affect the pitch. Then we have, as we were discussing a little bit earlier, we have this issue of spreading the difference out when we're tuning to a temperament. So I'm going to just demonstrate to you how, and so hopefully you can hear, this opening fifth. So between A and then the D below. So at the moment that's more or less pure, i.e. that there's no beating. And we're listening to the beating because when sound waves are in tune with each other, i.e. matching across the octave, the peaks and the troughs of the waves are in sync. And when they're not in sync, we get this what we call beating. And it's the beating that we're listening to determine the quality and where we want each note to be. So this is relatively pure. And now I'm going to actually raise the bottom D now slightly by turning the tuning hammer. And I'm going to effectively be kind of squashing this fifth by making the bottom note higher. And you'll hear it will start to beat. So I've done that fairly exaggeratedly, so that you can hopefully hear that. And we then proceed to tune all of the fifths of that opening octave. And then we've got that little part of the keyboard set, and that's ready for then transferring that just by tuning up in octaves like this, and getting all those in line with the ones beneath them. Now on this harpsichord there are actually 3 registers. So we tune that first register like that, and then we need to move on and tune the other ones if we're going to use them. Of course you don't have to use them in a particular concert or in a particular performance, but it really actually affects the resonance of the whole instrument. So what I then do is want to tune this next set of tuning pins, because I would start by tuning this back set, and then I would do this next set of tuning pins. And that's just a question of making each note not beating and exactly the same as its corresponding pitch string on the other stop. So let's, and actually I've deliberately not tuned earlier today, and because the weather's been a bit up and down, the other set of strings is very much not in tune at the moment, as you'll hear, and that's very good because it means I can show you how we can get one in tune. I think this low E flat was a particularly good example, if I'm not mistaken. You'll hear that it's got a really sort of a kind of wah-wah sort of feel because it's not in tune at all. Now that's not good. So I'll just show you how we can now tune this other set of strings to the ones that we would have already tuned. So I've now just released it even more, so it's right off. It doesn't sound good at all. And I'm gradually bringing it up. You can hear it getting more and more in tune. Now I'll deliberately take it a little bit sharp, a little bit too much, so you can hear how that beating will start on the other side. So that's now gone too far. And you can hear it's got that woo feeling to it. So I'll now release the tension again. Gone a bit too low. And that's about right there. And then that's that string done. And then we have to do that across the whole instrument. And of course tuning any string instrument, or in fact any instrument, is always a rather stressful thing to do in reality, because we're often tuning in a new place where we might have taken the harpsichord to a concert, and it's invariably going to be damper, warmer, cooler, drier than it is at home. So it's always a little bit of a challenge each time you go somewhere, how the instrument kind of responds to that, because the wood expands, the strings are affected in a different way, and of course we're actually listening for that beating, and with any background noise it's rather challenging to hear that. So one of the skills that you sort of have to develop as someone tuning a harpsichord is not only to be able to do these different temperaments and also to hear them, but actually to hear them when there's background noise going on as well. So having then tuned the instrument, we will then tune the other instruments to the harpsichord. Hello! Well, we're about to start rehearsing with Ensemble Hesperi, and we're going to show you a little bit about our tuning. The harpsichord's already been tuned this morning, but now I'm going to be handing on the tuning notes to Magda and Florence.
So usually either Magda or I will start tuning one at a time. So Tom will play various chords. So with my top A major, and well, this one is in tune, so I don't need to change it. Then for each string we're going to change chord. Each time a major one. Now we can hear that this is a bit flat. Now, there are two things to consider while we tune with chords. For me, I play the same part usually as the harpsichord, so I'm going to play the same notes exactly as what Tom is playing with his left hand. So I have to really match that note. However, sometimes if we are in a concert and the tuning has changed, then I will have to adapt a bit more and be more within the chord and within what it can, it will sound more in tune rather than just the note at the bass itself. So for example here I will try to tune more, and that's a pretty good one. And then we go to G, that's a bit sharp. That won't necessarily sound exactly like his bottom G. Let's try. It's a slight difference, but within the chord it sounds actually good.
Very good.
That same thing with a C within his chord sounds actually good. And then I will give it to Magda. The other thing is that we also can tune in fifths with the harpsichord. Mm-hmm.
So I usually tune each string individually, the same sort of process to Florence's tuning. Sometimes if there's a passage where I have lots of double stops, there are lots of fifths or even open strings, then I might check the fifths and just make sure that they sound good together. So that's a little bit flat. Now I'll check the D again. Sounds more or less okay. Sometimes if the string is just a tiny bit sharp, you can slightly tug on it rather than moving the whole peg, because that destabilizes the instrument. So sometimes I just tweak the string a little bit if it's only a tiny bit sharp. And finally the E I'll check with Tom's chord. It's very tempting to tune the E quite sharp to make a perfect fifth, so it's quite good to check with Tom and make sure it's low enough that it fits within the harmonies.
So there we are. That's how we transfer the tuning from the harpsichord onto the stringed instruments.
Okay, so Magda and Florence have tuned to Tom, and then there's me. Now, I try not to throw a spanner in the works when I come into this beautifully already in tune strings and harpsichord kind of thing going on. And the main way I do that is just to check with the harpsichord that the middle notes, the sort of the kind of central notes of my recorder are in tune in general, and that the recorder isn't too high or too low in pitch. So I talked about that last time, how I can change that by pulling the recorder out, or perhaps putting a ring in, and that's one way of making sure that I'm generally in tune with the violin and with the cello and the harpsichord. But of course, that only helps to a certain extent, because it's a bit different for recorder players than for string instruments. Of course, string instruments could slide out of tune, but hopefully they won't, and sort of, they like to stay at that point. But for recorders, we are constantly adjusting our tuning. And I'm often very mindful of the fact that I'm third in a chord, for example, and therefore I need to be higher or lower. And so I have to have lots of different fingerings to be able to change that, because I don't want simply to blow louder and then it might sound completely odd. It wouldn't fit in with the phrase. So recorder players actually have to learn a great deal of fingerings. And alternative fingerings is kind of one of the things that you start to learn post grade 8, or perhaps maybe a little before that. And as a professional, you're expected to know, I think, hundreds. I think there may be over 700 available alternative fingerings. Let me do one demo. So we have this beautiful note, G, on the alto. Now say I was going to play that at the end of a phrase. It sounds okay, because my recorder is really quite nicely in tune. But say I wanted to do a diminuendo at the end of that phrase. Oh dear, it's slightly under. That's not great. So I've done a diminuendo, but because I've dropped my breath pressure, it's now flat. So in order to avoid that, I can use an alternative fingering. And there are lots of different ones for G. We can do normal. Lovely alternative there. If you want to go even further, and that means that you can blow much, much, much less and still be in tune. So let's try perhaps with that, my favourite alternative fingering for G, and do that diminuendo again and see if it sounds better. Much better. And if I wanted to do a super, super big diminuendo, brilliant. And that's just one note. So we've got to be able to do that for pretty much most notes on the recorder. So with all those things, I'm doing that all the time as I'm playing. That's a little bit of a challenge, and of course when you're with, it's fair enough when you're by yourself or with the harpsichord, but with Florence and Magda, I'm also then thinking whether my notes are the same as theirs if I'm in unison with them. So it gets quite complex, but it's very fun, and I very much enjoy doing it. So now you know how we tune to get ready for a rehearsal or a concert. Of course, it doesn't always go to plan, does it? I mean, things can happen. For example, a string can slip right down on a violin or a cello, or perhaps sometimes recorders get bits of water in them, which affect the tuning in a terrible way. Can things happen to harpsichords as well?
They can. I mean, we can sometimes have situations where pins might slip, or a string might kind of unravel. There's a huge amount of tension on them. Or when there can be kind of fatigue in these strings that can cause them to tune as they move. Yeah, exactly. And all you can do is perhaps stop in that kind of scenario, apologise to your lovely audience, tune it, and start again. And that is just the way the world works. So I hope you've enjoyed that little insight into how we tune and how we get ready to perform, and the impact that has on our repertoire. Thank you, and see you next time.